The wild mountain man laughed at everyone until the Apache girl touched his scars. The blizzard hadn't waited for permission. It slammed into Gray Butte at dusk, driving men off the street and horses sideways, and in that white roar the mountain man called Calder Boone laughed at the world like he always did, hat tilted back, coat unbuttoned, daring the cold to bite harder, until the riderless pony staggered out of the storm with a small Apache girl clinging to its mane, lips blue, eyes too steady for her years. He saw her when the wind split for a breath, a narrow alley of snow opening between saloon and blacksmith, and he moved before anyone else did, boots chewing through drifts, laughter still on his mouth like a shield he'd forgotten to lower. Someone shouted that she wasn't his problem, and someone else said the agency wagon had tipped out by the creek and that more bodies might be under. But Calder didn't answer. He caught the pony's reins, slid his arms beneath the girl, and felt how light she was, light like a question, light like a prayer. Inside the livery the air smelled of wet hay and iron, lamps throwing a buttery glow that made the storm look farther away than it was, and the hostler hovered with straw in his beard, asking if this was trouble. And Calder said, "It's a child," and the word folded the room quiet. The girl's name came out in a whisper, Nita, along with a string of words the hostler didn't know. But Calder had ridden years along the high desert, and he knew enough to hear father and river and took, so he set his jaw and worked by simple truths. Take off the soaked blanket, wrap her in a horse blanket warmed near the lantern, find bread, find water, find heat. The lamp flame shivered and steadied, painting the scars on Calder's knuckles, the old claw marks across his forearm, the sharply healed seam that ran from ear to jaw like a lightning strike that never found the ground, and the men who had seen him laugh at debt, at winter, at deputies, watched him now not laughing at all. Outside, the wind keened. Inside, snow hissed to melt in his beard as he bent close and spoke low, telling Nita the kind of words a man keeps for his own dark nights. That fire remembers, that morning comes, that breath is a rope you don't let go. She shivered, eyes tracking the lantern, and when her hands slipped free from the blanket they found the map of him, the coarse coat, the bone button, the old leather, and then the line of his ruined jaw. And she touched those scars like a bell rope, not flinching, not pitying, only seeing, and the laugh that men feared in him died as if someone had pinched its wick. He felt the touch in places no doctor could name, felt how the storm outside matched the one inside that he rarely admitted to, and he didn't look away. The hostler pressed a tin cup into his hand. The girl sipped. The lamp breathed. The pony blew steam from its nose and watched like a worried uncle. "Folks'll say you've gone soft," the hostler muttered, and Calder answered without heat. "Folks say a lot to keep from hearing their own souls." He glanced at the blown door where snow crept in, at the street where men pretended not to notice a little life shaking itself back from the edge, and he stood, gathering her against him with care, like he was lifting a chair onto a porch built for dignity. And the words that rose in his chest surprised even him, quiet, certain, shaped for a vow. "You're safe," he said, and the storm knocked once more at the door, as if to disagree, and Nita's small hand rested against the thunderbolt on his jaw, and the room held still long enough for Mercy to find a seat. He didn't save her. She saved him. By dawn the storm had burned itself quiet, the wind a soft rasp over the white roofs, and Calder woke to the sound of Nita's shallow breathing beside the hearth, her tiny fingers still locked in the edge of his coat. He had dozed in the chair all night, boots off, gun belt hung on a peg, hat tilted low against the glow of the coals. The livery smelled of thawing leather and wet hay, and the horses shifted like restless souls waiting for morning to decide what kind of day it would be. Calder stirred the fire until it flared gold again, flames licking the blackened kettle, and he poured water slow, listening to its hiss like a heartbeat coming back. Nita blinked awake, eyes wide, dark as the desert after rain, and whispered something in her tongue that he didn't catch but understood all the same. "Thank you," or maybe just alive. He tore a piece of bread and dipped it in honey from his saddlebag, the good kind he kept for long rides when silence got too heavy, and she ate in small bites, patient as a deer, testing safety. When she smiled, barely, it hit him like a nail through quiet wood. He wasn't used to smiles that didn't want something. The scars along his jaw pulled tight, reminding him of every fight he'd walked away from, just because laughter was easier than bleeding again. Outside, men were shouting about the agency wagon found in the river bend, about missing riders and broken crates, and someone said they'd send word to Fort Stanton by noon. Calder didn't move. He knew what forts did with found children. They counted them, labeled them, moved them again. He looked at Nita, at the faint red mark on her wrist where rope had rubbed, and he felt that familiar split inside him between leaving and staying, between surviving and belonging. The fire cracked and threw up a spark that danced before dying, and she reached toward it, her eyes reflecting the light, unafraid. "It remembers," he said softly, and when she tilted her head, he added, "Fire. It keeps what it's given." She pointed at the faint smoke curling from the chimney and said a single word. "Home." It wasn't quite a question. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled his coat on, set his hat low, and said, "Maybe, but not yet." He would have to go to the river to see for himself what the storm had buried. As he reached for the door, Nita stood, still wrapped in the blanket, bare feet silent on the floor, and handed him his gloves like she'd done it all her life. For a moment their eyes met, his lined with years, hers lit with something older than fear, and the weight of that small trust steadied his hands better than any whiskey ever had. "Keep the fire," he said, voice rough. "Don't let it die till I'm back." She nodded solemnly, holding his knife as if it were a promise. Calder stepped into the frozen light, the kind that turns everything honest, and the wind carried his breath away down the empty street. Behind him, the livery door shut with a thud that sounded almost like a heartbeat choosing to continue. The snow stopped screaming. The river was swollen and cruel that morning, brown water biting through ice like it wanted to forget it ever froze. Calder followed the drag marks down the embankment where the wagon had gone over, his boots sinking deep into slush that smelled of pine and iron. Bits of wood and canvas bobbed along the bend, broken wheel, torn tarp, a child's shoe half filled with snow. He crouched low, resting one scarred hand on the wreckage, and felt the echo of what had happened here. The sudden tilt, the scream cut short, the silence that followed. The wind came down from the ridge and pushed his hat brim low, carrying voices that weren't there anymore. He'd seen death before, too many times to name, but this kind sat heavy in his chest because it was the kind that took without malice, the kind no bullet could avenge. A shout carried from upriver, two men from the town, roping through the current. One waved him off, saying there was nothing worth saving but bodies and broken things. Calder didn't answer. He kept walking the edge, eyes searching until he found what he didn't want to find. Two small shapes tangled in a juniper root, wrapped together like they'd tried to stay warm at the end. He swallowed hard, lifted his hat, and let the cold sting his face. "Rest easy," he muttered, and the river answered with another hiss against the rocks. Behind him, a rider came slow through the frost, coat-marked with the agency's insignia, young and proud, not yet used to the silence that follows bad news. "You the one found the girl?" the man called, voice clipped, already official. Calder turned. "She's alive. Then she'll be taken to the fort. Protocol." Calder's jaw flexed once. "Protocol don't tuck her in." The rider frowned. "You ain't her kin." "Don't need to be." They stood like that, two laws staring at each other, the written one and the one carved in scars. The younger man shifted in his saddle, uncertain, then looked down at the river as if it might argue for him. "Orders are orders," he said finally. "You bring her by sundown, or we come for her." Calder said nothing, just tipped his hat, turned back to the current, and watched it carry a scrap of red cloth downstream until it vanished. He knew then that by nightfall the town would talk, the fort would come, and the quiet he'd built would split open again. He climbed the bank slow, boots dragging mud and ice, and every step felt like walking toward a choice he'd made, long ago but forgotten how to name. By the time he reached the ridge, the valley lay open below, sunlight crawling down from the peaks, touching the livery roof like a blessing. Smoke rose from its chimney, steady, faithful, small. She'd kept the fire. Calder stood there a long time, hat in hand, until the cold crept into his bones again, and he finally said what the river had refused to. "You don't take her from me." Then he turned back toward town, every step a vow the mountains themselves might remember. By the time Calder returned to town, the snow had turned to slush, and the street outside the saloon was crowded with men pretending not to wait for a story to start. Word had already run ahead of him. The found Apache girl, the dead riders, the wagon crushed under ice. He saw the way they looked at him now, measuring his silence, wondering if the wild man had finally picked a side. Inside the livery, Nita sat by the fire just as he'd left her, hair still damp from melted snow, her blanket folded neat across her knees. The moment she saw him, her eyes searched his face for answers he didn't yet have, and he knelt beside her without a word, letting the firelight tell what the river couldn't. She didn't ask about her father. Children always knew the truth faster than grown men could speak it. Instead, she reached for his hand and pressed something small into his palm, a feather black at the tip and white at the base, tied with a strip of thread. "He gave it," she whispered. "Keep." The word hit him harder than a bullet. He tucked it in his coat pocket and nodded once, unable to speak for a long breath. When he finally did, his voice came low, steady as a promise. "We got riders coming from the fort. They'll say you belong to them." She shook her head fiercely, no fear in her eyes, only a tired kind of knowing. "You stay," he said softly. "Don't move till I say." Then he stood and pulled his duster tight, stepping out into the daylight that made the snow glare white as bone. The fort's men were already on the ridge, 3 of them, gray coats against the blue sky, one holding a folded paper like it meant something holy. They came slow but sure, hooves splashing through thawed mud, eyes already judging, already counting. The lead officer dismounted first, face clean-shaven and too young for the badge he wore. "You Boone?" he asked. Calder nodded. "Then you've got what's ours, girl from the wreck. Orders say she's to be returned." Calder studied him for a long beat, then answered, "She ain't yours till she chooses." The officer frowned. "You think this is about choice?" "Ain't it always?" Calder said. The wind carried their words down the street, where a few townsmen paused in their work, unsure which side decency was on. The officer unfolded the paper, hand shaking from cold or nerves, it didn't matter which. "You hand her over peaceable," he said, "or you'll answer to the law." Calder took one step closer, his shadow crossing the paper. "I've answered to worse." For a moment no one moved, the air between them thin as glass. Then the officer tucked the order away and muttered, "You got till sundown." They rode off without looking back, and the town exhaled as if it had been holding its breath. Calder watched them go, then turned toward the livery where Nita's small face waited behind the frost-streaked window. He touched the scar on his jaw, feeling it throb like an old wound waking, and muttered to himself, "If mercy's got a law, I reckon it starts here." The wind shifted, carrying wood smoke and the faint smell of bread from somewhere down the street, and for the first time in years, Calder Boone didn't feel like running. Sundown came slow that day, as if the sky itself couldn't decide whether to bleed or to rest. The town lay quiet under the fading gold, windows glowing soft against the cold that was coming back, and Calder sat on the porch outside the livery with Nita's blanket draped over his knees, watching the horizon like a man counting heartbeats he didn't own. Inside, the girl slept curled near the fire, one hand resting on his worn coat where it hung over her like a shelter made of old mistakes. The townsfolk had stopped by all afternoon, some with bread, some with questions, some just to see what kind of man invites a storm into his house, and each time he'd said the same thing. "She stays till she's warm." That should have been enough. But decency never travels alone, and by dusk the saloon talk had turned to law, and law had a way of turning into fear. He could hear them faintly now, the murmur of men, the scrape of boots, the clink of guns being checked for pride rather than need. He thought about leaving, about saddling his mare and riding into the mountains like he'd done a dozen times before when the world got too small for a man like him. But when he looked through the open door and saw Nita's hair lit by the firelight, soft as raven's down, he knew that running wasn't the same as saving. The memory of his brother's voice came back then, low and mocking from a lifetime ago. "You can't fix what's wild, Calder. You just survive it." He smiled at the lie, slow and bitter. Maybe survival wasn't enough anymore. Maybe mercy needed a place to live. He rose, took the rifle from the wall, and checked the chamber, not out of threat, but promise. Outside, the last of the sun slid behind the ridge, and the street filled with shadows long enough to remember every sin this town had buried. The fort's riders would come soon, clean uniforms and cold orders, and they'd take her like they were doing God a favor. He'd seen that kind of favor before. The fire popped behind him, and Nita stirred, whispering something half-dreamed, her voice barely a breath. Stay. Just that, a word like a tether. He set the rifle down again and crouched beside her, brushing the soot from her cheek. I'm here, he said. Ain't going nowhere. For a moment the wind outside paused as if listening. Then the church bell rang once, hollow and late, and the sound rolled through the town like a warning and a prayer at the same time. Calder looked toward the door. The light from the fire stretching long across the floorboards, and he knew the moment had come where laughter couldn't protect him anymore. He reached into his pocket, touched the feather she'd given him, and felt something steady, something worth breaking for. You don't die here, he said quietly, not sure if he was talking to her or himself. They came when the moon had just cleared the ridge, pale light spilling over the frozen roofs like a truth that couldn't hide anymore. 3 riders first, then 5, the fort's men moving through the slush with the stiff precision of orders they didn't believe in but were bound to obey. Calder heard them before he saw them. The jingle of reins, the creak of leather, the kind of silence that sits on men who know they might be wrong. He stood in the doorway of the livery, rifle balanced in one hand, lantern light behind him painting his shadow long across the snow. You're late, he said when the lead officer reined up, voice calm, not cruel. Roads were bad, the man replied, glancing at the window where Nita's small face was just visible. We'll take her now. Calder's eyes narrowed slightly, not angry, just final. She's warm, fed, and breathing. That's more than I can say for your river. The officer stiffened. You think mercy gives you the right to disobey? No, Calder said, but it gives me reason. The men behind the officer shifted, uneasy. The youngest of them, barely 20, wouldn't meet Calder's gaze. He looked at the snow instead, as if afraid it might remember him. This ain't your fight, the officer warned. Then maybe it's everyone's, Calder replied. He took one step forward, boots crunching on the ice, rifle lowered but ready. You'll walk in there polite, you'll see she's alive, and you'll leave without taking what don't belong to you. The officer hesitated. And if I don't? Calder looked past him at the stars coming out, small, cold, stubborn lights that refused to die even in winter, and said quietly, Then you'll find out what happens when a man laughs at the wrong thing. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then the officer raised a hand, signaling his men to dismount. We'll see the girl. Calder stepped aside but didn't move far. Nita sat by the hearth, blanket around her shoulders, eyes wide but calm, as if she knew this part of the story wasn't meant for fear. The youngest soldier took off his gloves and knelt beside her, studying her bruised wrist, the way she held her chin high like someone twice her age. When he looked up, something in his face had changed, some understanding too simple for orders to erase. Sir, he said softly, she's safer here. The officer frowned, torn between duty and something older. Calder didn't press him. Mercy doesn't beg. After a moment, the man exhaled and said, Keep her warm. The fort will send word. They turned and rode out slow, no one speaking. Calder watched them disappear into the white horizon until only the sound of hooves on crusted snow remained. Then he set the rifle aside and closed the door, sealing in the warmth, the light, and the choice he'd made. Nita looked up at him, small and certain. They go? She asked. For now, he said, but they'll be back. He nodded, kneeling so their eyes met in the firelight. Then we'll be ready. She reached out, touching the scar along his jaw again, and he realized it didn't ache anymore. Outside, the wind shifted to the south, carrying the smell of pine and thawing earth, the kind of scent that promises spring but never too soon. And for the first time since the storm, Calder Boone laughed, not at the world, but with it. The snow had melted into shallow mud by morning, and the town smelled of wet earth and gun oil. that uneasy mix that means men are trying to return to peace but haven't forgotten violence yet. Calder woke before sunrise, sitting up in the chair he'd never left, the fire now just a slow red breath in the hearth. Nita was still asleep, her face half buried in his coat, the lines of fear smoothed away for the first time since the river. He moved quiet, feeding the embers until they glowed, and poured water into the tin cup, the sound soft enough not to wake her. Outside, the valley was gray-blue, the kind of light that makes the world look clean before men walk across it. The saloon door creaked open somewhere up the street and boots echoed on the boards. But no one came near the livery. Folks had learned to let silence do the talking when Calder Boone was in it. He stepped out onto the porch, the morning cold biting sharp through his shirt, and watched the ridge where the fort's trail disappeared. They'd be back soon enough. Orders didn't sleep long. But something in the air felt changed, like even the mountains were waiting to see which kind of law would win, paper or mercy. Behind him, Nita stirred, whispering his name for the first time. It caught him off guard, soft and real, like a song he'd forgotten he knew. "You're up early," he said, trying to hide the warmth that came with it. She nodded, rubbing her eyes, then pointed to the door. "Hungry?" He smiled without meaning to. "Then we'll see what the town's willing to trade for peace." He took her hand, small, strong, and led her down the muddy street. Windows opened as they passed. Some faces turned away, some nodded shyly. None spoke. At the bakery, Mrs. Harlan set a loaf on the counter before he could ask, eyes glistening like she'd found a crack in her own wall. "For the girl," she said. "No charge." He tipped his hat, not out of pride, but thanks that didn't fit in words. As they walked back, Nita skipped once, testing joy like it might break if she used too much of it. Calder felt the sound of it echo in his chest long after it stopped. The fire was waiting when they returned, steady, golden, remembering its promise. Nita sat close, breaking bread with both hands, and Calder watched her, realizing that for all his years laughing at the world, he'd never once been part of it. The wind outside softened. The smell of thawing pine drifted through the cracks, and he leaned back in his chair, whispering mostly to himself, "Maybe mercy's louder when it's quiet." And for a while, the silence agreed. By midday, the thaw had reached the creek, the ice breaking apart in long sighs that sounded almost human, and the water ran clearer than it had since the storm. Calder stood there with his sleeves rolled up, washing the soot from his hands, watching sunlight scatter across the ripples. Behind him, Nita gathered small stones in her skirt, humming some half-remembered tune that belonged to her people and the wind both. For a man who had once thought laughter was armor, the sound of that humming felt like truth, simple, weightless, unarguable. He looked back toward town and saw Sheriff Dorr riding slow, his hat tilted low against the glare. Dorr wasn't a cruel man, just tired of holding other men's mistakes, and when he stopped beside the creek, his horse snorted clouds of steam into the warming air. "Heard the fort pulled back," Dorr said. Calder nodded. "For now." The sheriff took off his hat, turning it in his hands. "You got the whole town wondering which kind of outlaw you're fixin' to be." Calder smiled faintly. "The quiet kind. Ain't many of those left." Dorr looked at the girl, who was now trying to skip a stone across the widening water. "You know keeping her here puts a mark on you." "Already got one," Calder said, tapping the scar that split his jaw. The sheriff studied him for a long beat, then said, "There's more law and kindness than there ever was in paper. Just don't let the fort forget that." He reined around and rode off slow, leaving only hoofprints and the faint smell of dust warming back into the earth. Calder turned toward the girl. She was smiling now, truly smiling, and holding up the stone that had skipped twice before sinking. "You see?" she said proudly. "It flies first." He crouched beside her, nodding. "That's how the good ones do." When they walked back, the light had gone soft, turning the valley the color of forgiveness. He built the fire higher, cooked beans and bread, and they ate in silence that wasn't empty anymore. Later, when she'd fallen asleep, he sat watching the flames twist and dance, and it came to him how strange it was that mercy never made a sound when it changed a man. It just rewrote the way he looked at the world. He thought of the fort's officer, of the sheriff's weary face, of the town that had begun to nod instead of stare. For the first time in years, Calder Boone didn't feel like he owed the world a fight. He only owed it care. Outside, coyotes cried somewhere on the far ridge, but their song wasn't mournful tonight. It was just a way of saying life still moved. Calder leaned back, whispering toward the fire. Let it fly first, then land where it's needed. The flame flickered like it understood. The next morning came warm enough for the mud to shine, and the world smelled like new beginnings that didn't ask permission. Calder woke to the sound of hooves somewhere beyond the ridge, a rhythm too steady for strays. He rose slow, the old stiffness in his shoulders reminding him that peace always carried a price. Nita was still asleep, curled close to the hearth, her braid undone, face soft with the kind of rest only safety gives. He pulled the blanket up around her and stepped outside, the air clean and sharp, carrying birdsong from the cottonwoods by the creek. On the far slope, he saw them. 3 riders, moving slow, their coats pale against the morning. Not the fort this time. Apache riders, proud and silent, the sun glinting off their bridles like small fires. Calder's breath caught, not in fear, but in knowing this meeting would decide whether mercy was a wound or a bridge. He didn't reach for the rifle. Instead, he walked out from the livery, hands open, palms forward, the way a man does when he's ready to be measured by truth. The lead rider was older, face carved by weather and grief, a feather woven through his braid. When he dismounted, his boots sank deep into the thawing ground. "The child?" he asked in rough English, the words more spirit than sound. "Safe," Calder said quietly. "Inside. Warm." The man's eyes flicked to the cabin, then back to Calder. "She is of my blood. My brother's daughter." Calder nodded. "I found her by the river. The storm took the rest." The old warrior's gaze softened, pain hidden behind dignity. "You gave her life again." Calder shook his head. "She took it back herself. I just held the rope." For a long moment neither spoke, the wind rustling through thawed grass, the mountains listening. Then the man lifted his hand, signaling to the others. A young woman rode forward, dismounted, and went inside. Calder waited, heart pounding slow and heavy until the door opened again, and Nita came out, her small fingers clasped in the woman's hand. She looked at Calder, half smiling, half afraid, as if torn between 2 worlds that both claimed her. Calder crouched to her level, eyes steady. "You go with them, little one. They're yours." She shook her head hard, whispering, "You too." He swallowed the ache that rose in his throat, reached into his coat, and pulled out the feather she'd given him. He tied it gently to the end of her braid, saying, "Now we both carry it." The old warrior watched without interrupting, then laid a hand on Calder's shoulder, light, sure, like the closing of a wound. "You are friend to my people," he said. "The hills will remember your step." Calder nodded, unable to speak. Nita climbed onto the woman's horse, looking back again and again as they rode off toward the ridge, her hand lifted in a farewell that felt like sunlight finding its way into a dark room. When they vanished into the trees, Calder stood alone by the door, the wind brushing through his hair, and whispered, "You don't lose what you give." The world answered with silence, the kind that heals instead of haunts. Weeks later, spring climbed the slopes of Gray Butte, turning the last of the snow into 1,000 silver threads that fed the creek. The town had gone back to its small noises, hammer on wood, horse hooves in thawed mud, the sound of life trying to remember itself. Calder still lived by the livery, mending saddles for travelers, trading quiet for peace. But some nights when the fire dropped low, he'd catch himself listening for a child's laughter that wasn't there anymore. On those nights he'd take her feather from the shelf, turn it in his fingers till the lamplight caught the white edge, and the silence would grow soft again. The fort never came back, and the townsfolk stopped whispering, maybe because they'd seen what mercy could build when no one called it weakness. One morning, Sheriff Dorr rode by with news from the south. Apache riders had been seen near the ridge, just passing, peaceful. Calder nodded, a slow, knowing smile under his beard. That evening he walked out to the creek where he'd first found her kin, the water now clear and kind, and sat on the old boulder half covered in moss. The sun slid low behind the ridges, the world bathed in that warm gold that forgives everything for a moment, and he closed his eyes, hearing the same tune Nita used to hum, carried back to him in the wind. He felt the weight of his scars, but they no longer burned. They just belonged, like everything else the land decided to keep. Somewhere across the valley a wolf called once, deep and long, not mourning but marking. Calder stood, hat in hand, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to laugh at anything. He just looked at the light resting on the horizon, steady and unafraid, and whispered, "She found her way." The wind brushed against him like a small hand once did, and he smiled through the ache, turned back toward the cabin, and saw smoke curling from its chimney, the same small fire that had never died. He walked inside, shut the door gently behind him, and the last of the day poured through the window, lighting every corner like a blessing that chose to stay. If this story reminded you that redemption doesn't come easy, but it always comes for those who choose mercy, then share it so others remember too. Subscribe to Redemption West, where every wound learns to heal, every silence learns to speak, and every story proves that love still builds.